when I was working at Spotify, for example, we had on-call schedules where obviously, like, if somebody, can you imagine somebody wants to listen to like the latest Taylor Swift and they're going to hit play, and when they hit play everything falls apart. Oh my gosh, I can't listen to the new song. We need on-call, but at the same time, every time we had on-call, there was one day off you get for every day you spend on call. So it's this nice compensatory model where the company was looking out for people's health. It sounds like practices like this in situations where negative health outcomes are sort of part of the job is also something that G2I is working towards.
Yeah, I think also with the on-call example, we would also advocate for like clear lines of communication and basically aligning on like what constitutes an on-call like request, what is an emergency, what needs to be fixed now, what or versus like something that can wait until the next day. So I think also being really clear on that, because I've definitely worked in situations where it's like the CSS is messed up and I'm like, why am I getting a message at 9 p.m. about CSS? Like, we can fix this tomorrow morning.
Yeah. Yeah, the button's just off by 10 pixels and someone goes, no, it's a complete disaster. I can see these risk factors for mental that then leads to physical health negative outcomes, but a lot of what we're talking about so far sounds sort of outside in, right? It's the pressure that comes from the organization or the deadline or the on-call schedule that then cultivates a sense of stress, adrenaline in us. Oh my gosh, I need to stay alert for this, and maybe we don't sleep. I've been in situations, for example, where I go to bed and I can't sleep because I'm thinking about, oh, I'm going to get pinged, and then I just don't sleep. And as we know, sleep is the absolute foundation of all kinds of health, mental, physical, all the kinds. So that just leads to a cascade of really negative things. The question I had for you is, since all of this is outside in, have you seen cases, or are you familiar with cases where it's the other way around, right? Like, there's no real outside pressure, but just very driven, very curious 10x engineers are like, no, I have to solve this problem and I have to do it now. And then this leads to sort of, they have some weird like internal overachiever pressure that can maybe even bleed out onto the organization and affect teams and maybe managers and so on.
Yeah, I would say that this isn't like even rare at all. This is pretty common as well. And it's part of our operating system that we ask people to really reflect on their days and like the way that they work so that they can, because I don't think anybody would immediately say that like, oh, I'm pressuring myself. Who wants to put pressure on themselves? Who wants to harm themselves or make themselves uncomfortable or stress themselves out? And so I think it's the default perception that the stress is coming from the outside in. And I am extremely guilty of this too. But then when you take a step back, it's like, who's asking you to do this? These things that you're doing throughout the day that you're outlining, that you would outline to say, like, this is how I spend my day. These are the tasks that I'm working on. Are they things that people are really asking you to do? And of course, some are going to be things that people are asking you to do, but some are going to be things that you're putting on yourself. And one thing that I think a lot of developers do is they after hours, they're going to work on a tutorial or they're going to learn something new. And learning something new is exciting. But if you're like, I have to get through this Udemy course, like by the end of the month, it's like, well, that's not very fun. And, if your work isn't asking you to learn this thing, then what's the point of having a deadline by the end of the month that is stressing you out? It's one thing to be held accountable, but it's another thing when it starts to have an effect on you. And I think like also learning the signs of things and learning the names of things helps a lot with identifying when you're about to burn out. So like if you start to notice that your personality is changing, if you start to notice that you have a shorter temper or that you don't want to spend time with people that you care about, or you're skipping meals, like there's all of these little signposts that like this thing that you're adding onto the top of your pile is hurting you. It's not helping you. And so you need to reevaluate that maybe and figure out what are the priorities of all the things that you're working on. What really is your priority and what is nice to have and is something that should be fun and make you feel better. And also ask yourself, why isn't it making me have fun or like feel good? There's a lot to learn, but we emphasize a lot of like question everything, look inside, try not to deflect, try not to say that it's outside of you or say that you don't have control of it. Like try to see things objectively as possible.
Yeah, I think that's so worth repeating almost, right? Because um, for a lot of folks, sometimes you do need to drive hard and you do need that stress. I mean, I think there's even in the medical literature, I read this mindset. It's called the stresses enhancing mindset, where people like they're told it was a cool experiment where there were two groups of people, and group A was told stress is actually bad. It's going to give you a heart attack, and group B was told stress gives you superpower. Like this adrenaline makes you really strong. People have lifted cars off of like a relative who was under them, and so on. So two different narratives, and then they subjected them to some stress. And as it turned out, the people who believed stress was enhancing did better on the tests, right? And so I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. Like this question everything you mentioned. There's like reevaluate. Is this worth it? Because I can imagine scenarios where, and unfortunately, even some guests on the podcast grew up in poverty, like slums, and they needed a way out. And they worked really hard. I mean, their adrenaline system was absolutely hammered, but in their case, it was totally worth it, right? And it paid off. Now they're living in like really great situations, and they earn tech money and so on. But I think for cases where I just want to understand how to fine tune a machine learning model, and you stay up like all night for 3 days because of this internal pressure, I guess that's what would prompt one asking themselves, is this actually worth it? I've been guilty of that, to be fair. I have just stayed up for 3 days straight studying machine learning. Awesome. We talked about emotional health. We talked about physical health and how emotional health sort of is the journey to the destination that is physical health. What about emotional health? Is that a component here as well, or is it just a tangent of mental health?
It's funny, we actually used to say mental, physical, emotional health all together. And I think that it is, I think that it is, I think that it is worth stating in its own right. But in conversation, I think from a marketing perspective as well, it could kind of like throw people off a little bit. Because emotional feels almost the opposite of professional. I don't agree with that. But it was like, maybe we can mix emotions in it, because again, going back to kind of how I think about it, it is all together. I mean, if mental health is physical health, emotional health is also physical health, because emotions are changes in your body, changes in how in what hormones and chemicals are being released in your body and your brain. And so things are always happening. And so I consider emotional health a part of this just as much as anything else.
This really, I didn't like hearing that it's just because it's not as quote unquote professional.